So when I first conceived of the idea for this book about 20 years ago, the phrase we're going to talk about today is one of the first Christian cliches I thought of. It probably had to do with a board meeting I was involved in where we were trying to set the missions budget for our organization. One of the other board members was arguing that we should give away less money. He was saying, we don't really even know what happens to the money after we give it away. We don't know if the people we're giving it to really need it or not. He made the argument that we should really keep the money we raised within our own organization. And then he said the phrase. He said, after all, doesn't charity begin at home? It seems to me most of the time that I hear this phrase, that's the context. The argument that the resources we have are better spent on ourselves or those are in our inner circle rather than given to some faceless stranger in another community or another country. So most of the time I hear this phrase, it's as a justification against being generous. So I thought this would be an easy phrase for me to kind of pull apart and look at biblically, but surprisingly, as I began to study it, I found that this phrase has more going for it than I originally gave it credit for. In fact, when used in the proper way, this phrase might be, of all the phrases that we're going to consider, the one that comes closest to expressing biblical truth. Used correctly, thought of in the right way, this phrase can be both beautiful and helpful. So let's get into it. Let's start as we usually do with our first question. Is there any biblical truth in this phrase? The passage we need to look at here is 1 Timothy 5, verses 3 through 4, and also verse 8. It says this, give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn first of all to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. And we skip to verse 8. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So in the Bible, widows are often singled out as receiving special care and concern from God. There's something like 80 references to widows in the Bible. Psalm 68 verse 5 says that God is the father to the fatherless and the defender of the widow. And so Israelites in the Old Testament, Christians in the New Testament are called upon to have a special charitable concern for those who are without husband. That's what this passage is about. But notice it starts with an interesting phrase. Paul says that we should give proper recognition to those widows who are really, really in need. I don't think he means that there's some sort of income level after which, if a widow falls below it, then she merits special concern from the church. Rather, he tells us what he means in the next verse. A widow who's really in need is one who doesn't have immediate children or grandchildren to provide for her. Those are the ones that the church should especially be looking out for and lending aid to. But if a widow has living children or grandchildren, then Paul says here, the last part of verse 4, that the children and grandchildren should learn, first of all, to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family, and so repaying their parents and grandparents. So the widow who has children to provide for her, then those children, those grandchildren should step up and lend or provide for their widowed mother, grandmother, what she needs, instead of depending on the church to provide when the children and grandchildren can do so. So verse 8 kind of sums it all up like this. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And so really for us to be providing for orphans or widows on the other side of the ocean or even right across the street when we're not caring for those in our own household, well, Paul says that is to deny the faith. That's to act like an unbeliever. If we don't provide for those closest to us, then we have no business caring for those far away. And in this sense, then, here's, I believe, the biblical background or backing for the statement, charity begins at home. We can argue about whether or not, taking care of those in your own family actually meets the modern definition of the word charity, but as far as that phrase and what we often mean when we say it, charity begins at home, we can see there is some biblical merit to it. If that's the case, then, is there anything wrong with us using this phrase? We'll have to ask our second question. Where does this statement go wrong? And again, we need to go back to the context in which I most often hear this phrase used. When we're talking about charitable giving outside of our homes, and then we claim this statement as some sort of justification against being generous. Often when I hear someone say charity begins at home, what's implied is that it also ends there. That the need to provide for myself and those closest to me is just so great that I couldn't possibly consider helping anyone else. I see at least three problems with that mindset or that way of thinking. And the first one is this: it's selfish. Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4 say this: do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking for your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. So let's face it, when we use the phrase, charity begins at home, as a justification for not giving to this cause or that, what we're really saying is, well, I'd rather spend the money on myself than to give it to someone else. It's not like we have a widowed mother at home to take care of, or that we recently began caring for a foster child in need, but it's more like, well, I'd kind of like a new TV in my family room, or I want to have a little extra money to go out on Friday night. We need to be careful about creating some sort of false equivalence between our wants and the needs of those who are poor. And there's a fundamental difference between the wants and needs of the average American family and the wants and needs of, say, a family living in a third world country. It doesn't mean we need to reduce ourselves to third world levels of income or possessions, but it does show the superficiality of using that phrase, charity begins at home. And another problem is when we use this phrase, we often act as though compassion were a zero-sum game. So a zero-sum game implies that if you win, I have to lose. It's this idea that the scales must always be in balance. And so when we use the phrase, charity begins at home, to justify not giving to this cause or that, what we're really saying is that if I have care and concern for this thing, I have that much less care and concern for something else. It treats compassion as though it were a finite resource. I only have so much compassion to give, and after that, I run out. And the danger in that is that compassion should never be a finite resource. That is, if I care about one cause, say I care about feeding hungry school children here in America, that doesn't mean I can't also care about feeding hungry school children in a third world country. Care and compassion for one thing does not eliminate the possibility of caring and having compassion for other things. 1 Thessalonians, Paul says this. He says, may the Lord make your love increase and overflow for each other and everyone else, just as ours does for you. I think when we begin to love others, we find that our love can overflow, that there's more than enough. In fact, the more we love, the more love we have to share with others. The third problem I see is that it creates a leftover mindset for our giving. We get this idea, when we say charity begins at home, really what we're saying is if I'm going to give money outside of the home, I'll do so after I've taken care of everything else. That is, first I've got to pay the mortgage or the rent, and I've got to buy some groceries and make the car payment. And then I got to buy some clothes for the kids and maybe buy something nice for myself. And then I'm going to put some money in savings. And then maybe I save a little so we can go have some fun on the weekend. And only then, after everything else has been paid for, if there's anything left over, that's what I'll give to the church, or that's what I'll give to charity. Of course, the problem with that mindset is often by the time we get to the end of the month, we find there's very little left over. And that's why when the Bible talks about giving, it often uses the image of first fruits. Proverbs 3, verse 9 is an example. It says, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of your crops. And what I take that to mean is when it comes to making a budget, we need to begin with our giving plan. and then fit all of our other obligations and goals around that giving plan. And so that when it does come time to give, we give from an abundance and not from a scarcity. And the same idea comes to volunteering or using your time. Often we'll say, well, when I have more time, I'll volunteer for this organization or that. And we often find we never get around to it. Using the phrase charity begins at home is not an excuse for bringing our leftovers to God. So, we've already seen now that this phrase, charity begins at home, that it is true in the sense that Christians have a moral and ethical obligation to take care for and provide for their own families. But we've also seen that the way we most often use this phrase as an excuse against being generous with others is not in keeping with the Bible. Now, let's talk about whether there's better news in the gospel. And of course there is. The gospel is really about the selflessness and sacrifice of Jesus, giving himself, giving up the privileges and rights he has as the Son of God in order to sacrifice himself on our behalf. And not just our behalf, those closest to him, but for the whole world. 2 Corinthians 8:9, probably my favorite summary, single verse summary of the gospel in all the scripture. It says this, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich." Jesus sacrificed for us. And so as those who follow him, as those who are called after his name, we too should be sacrificial. And not just with those in our immediate circle, but with people in need far and wide. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells the story of the sheep and the goats, this sort of great sorting that takes place at the end of time. Jesus is going to tell the righteous to stand on one side. Those are the sheep. He's going to tell the goats to stand on another side, the unrighteous. And the difference between the two is found in their care and compassion for others. Matthew 25, verse 37. "Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you? Or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and we clothed you? And when did we see you sick and in prison and go to visit you?' And the king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me.'" Jesus is sacrificial in his care for others. He calls us to be sacrificial as well, to care for the poor, to feed the hungry, to reach out to the oppressed, to be kind to the stranger. All right, finally, I want to go back to the phrase, charity begins at home, and I want to ask whether maybe we've been looking at this phrase wrong. Because as I studied it, I found a fairly good case to be made that rather than implying that our resources should be first spent in the home, that this phrase may be telling us that the practice of charity should be learned first in the home. I think some of the confusion may come from the way the word charity has changed its meaning over time. This phrase, charity begins at home, actually dates back to, in English, to the days of Shakespeare. And you may know in the King James Bible, which also dates back to the days of Shakespeare, that the word most often used to translate the Greek word agape, which is the word for God's love, God's sacrificial, God's generous love, that in the King James Version, that word is usually translated as charity. So the famous love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, faith, hope, and charity, but the greatest of these is charity. And so charity, when this phrase was first coined, meant not so much giving financial resources to the poor as much as it meant sacrificial and generous love. And so it wouldn't be wrong for us to read this phrase now as love begins in the home. That is, as we learn to love in our families, that gives us the resources and the character to go and love those outside of our homes. Well, what I'm trying to say is when people first said charity begins at home, what they were really saying was that as we learn to love in our families, we become the kind of people who can go out and love the world. So this phrase is more of an instruction for how to create more generous people, which pretty much makes it the opposite of how we use it today as an excuse for not being generous. So I've got 2 points of application. The first is that we need to learn to be generous in our families. It's easy for us to think, well, I need to pinch pennies. I need to be very austere. We need to live simply so we have more money to give away. And I would argue that we need to be generous in our families, with our spouses, with our children, with those closest to us. One of the best ways our children are going to learn about the generous and lavish love of God, their Father, is when they see generosity in their parents. Not an excuse to spend money on ourselves, but rather an opportunity to be liberal with our children, with our spouses, and others in our household. And then second, we need to teach our families to be generous. As adults, we should volunteer, but we should also bring our children with us and teach them to volunteer. We should pick charities that we want to support, and then we should involve our children in those charities as well. Every family should have a plan, a giving plan, and let your children know what your giving plan is and how you've prioritized your money. Randy Alcorn said that we should be raising a generation of givers, not keepers. Givers, not keepers. We live in a period with almost unlimited more resources, more income than almost any generation that's come before us. And so we have the opportunity to be more generous than any of our ancestors ever did. And so we should be teaching our children to be generous. Charity begins at home. Does not mean that we take our money and spend it on ourselves first, but it does mean that a practice of charity, that a mindset of generosity is first learned within our families.